Okay, so I'm now going to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Jochen Markard. So Dr. Markard is a leading researcher on sustainability transitions in the Department of Management, Technology and Economics in the ETH Zurich, which is a prestigious Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. He has degrees in electrical engineering and in energy economics, and he has a PhD in innovation studies. He's also recently been appointed to the chair of the board for the Sustainability Transitions Research Network, who held their annual conference this year in Ottawa, and I think some people in the audience went to that. His research, part of his research, looks at interactions between technology, actor strategies, politics, policies, and institutional structures. And his current projects include looking at political economy of energy transitions, transition pathways, and the decline of industries such as coal. So I'd like you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Markard for his presentation on sustainability transitions, foundations, experiences, and policy implications. Thank you.
Thank you. Now with all the, thinking about what does a transition mean to me, I'm supposed to answer, now the question, what are transitions about? And you can challenge me after all the thinking you did before. This is not a classical research talk. So it's more an introduction and overview to transitions, as an empirical phenomenon, and also a bit the theory behind transitions. So I try to guide you through the field, and I might skip or be quick with a few slides. So there are more slides in my desk than I actually need, but you might want to use them at a later point. So this is why I put them in there. So 4 topics, starting with the sustainability challenges, then a few words on the empirics of energy transitions, then kind of the theory part, and if we have time, a view into the policy implications. So first of all, the grand sustainability challenges. We know that, we're using resources, we're emitting toxic substances on many levels, and there are different frameworks to capture the sustainability impacts we have, like the SDGs or the planetary boundaries. And the point I'm trying to make here is that some of these sustainability challenges are very special and very complex and very demanding for us to solve. So here's a list of things. We don't have to go through them, but there are some things, like, for example, that there are competing solutions to a sustainability problem, and so people are not just fighting about whether to address the challenge in the first place, but also how to address it. Then, of course, with all these struggles, there are conflicts. It's about values, what matters more, clean air, health, income, jobs. There are many trade-offs involved in these. So it's a highly political questions we're dealing with. Just to show, for the example of climate change, for example, just here the technological options we have. For example, we had this debate of what is the future of mobility, and for many years people were saying, oh, it's the hydrogen, it's the fuel cell car. Meanwhile, people are saying it's the electric vehicle. But is that the future? Is that the future of a sustainable mobility? Is there more than the car? So these bigger questions are at stake here. Also, we have all these infrastructures in place, which are pretty resistant, which are built and then they remain there for a long time. So there is inertia in the system. It takes a long time to change things again once they're built. And as I said before, we have all these conflicting interests. business interests, social movements, different initiatives pushing for different objectives. So this is part of the complexity we're facing. People have called it, and it has been mentioned before, and Dror and others have worked on this. People have called it a wicked problem because of these complexities. And there had been initiatives saying, we have had the Manhattan Project, we have put a man on the moon, so climate change, we can also address if we have solved these big problems before, we also can address and solve climate change. But then there are all these issues, and some of which I already mentioned, that make climate change very different from putting a man on the moon. So if we have a special kind of problem, we might also want to reconsider whether our established frameworks are the right tools to address this specific kind of problem. So that's the basic point I want to get here. But before getting into the theory, I would like to present you a few examples of transitions actually happening. And one of the fields where a transition, or where we see many examples of transition developments happening, is the field of energy. So bear with me for a while to go into energy and look at what is going on here. So first of all, in energy, we have seen transitions in the past. So this is just from different energy carriers that were dominant at a time and how they have changed over time. So when I'm talking about the energy transition right now, and I'm referring to the ongoing energy transition, which is the transition from fossil and nuclear fuels to renewable energies. Of course, we had always hydropower, but here we are talking about this new, meanwhile they're not so new anymore, but these newer renewable energies. This is the electricity generation in Canada. The question to you is this, and it's over 25 years of time, so this is usually a time span when we look at transitions. The question to you is, who believes electricity in Canada is in a state of transition? You can raise your hands. Is there a transition you see in this picture? Who believes yes? Nobody? Who believes there is no transition? Who doesn't believe anything? So let's try again. Who believes there is no transition in the electricity sector? So one hand, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10. What about the rest? You didn't raise your hand. Oh, okay. So you believe that there is a transition. Okay, so who believes there is a transition? Okay, now we're getting more. Who believes there is no transition? Oh, it's still a 50-50. So you're both right, depending on what you're looking at. If you look at the entire sector, just as depicted here for the entire country, you may find, there is not so much going on, maybe except from the little blue thing in the end, from the wind thing, right? But you can say, I'll show you different pictures in a minute. You can argue this is not really a transition we are seeing. But, for example, if we zoom in and look into specific places like Ontario, what we see here is like the black line, that is the decline of coal-fired power production in Ontario. So Ontario was one of the provinces and one of the places worldwide that used coal and completely phased out coal. So that's a story, and it was you see, it was replaced by nuclear and by natural gas, and also by renewable energies. So, there are transitions, or zooming in, there has been a transition in the electricity sector in Canada. And this kind of transition has also happened elsewhere. Here, for example, to look at the UK, this is how messed up such a graph can look like. And especially here in the last years, we see a rapid decline again in coal. Coal is the black line. It's also in the UK, it has almost been phased out. For example, this is just this year's graph from The Guardian, and you see here that in green is the number of coal-free days in the electricity system of the UK, and you see here in 2018 there were a few days, and in 2019 there were already many. Yeah? And then you can go from country to country, and I'll show you one more example. Again, a stage of development. This is pre-transition, pretty stable lines, This is the 1990s. That was in Germany. This is where I'm from. That was in the 1990s, a campaign from large electric utilities, a press campaign telling everybody, there will never be a time that renewable energies will be able to produce more than 4% of the country's electricity supply. And when I saw this campaign, I was studying electrical engineering back then, and I pretty much believed them, because I also could not imagine that such a transition could be happening. And why 4%? Well, the 4% is exactly here, the blue line of the hydropower. So essentially they were saying, the hydropower we have, this is what we're going to have in the future, but not more. The utilities, just as a note on the politics, the utilities were also suing the government for subsidizing other forms of energy production like wind and solar. So they were really fighting against it. And then just a while later, so in 2015, renewables surpassed all other forms of electricity production were the biggest source for the first time, and today Germany is at 45%. So this, I would argue, is an ongoing transition, and as we go back at this graph, this is then how it can look like. You see the alternative energies, solar, biomass, and wind going up. And then you also see, in Germany there's a specific attention to nuclear energy. You see nuclear going down, but lately you also see coal going down. But there is also still it's not that the transition is completed anytime soon, and it's a challenge to phase out like two dominant technologies. They're phasing out nuclear and coal, and they're trying to phase out also coal now. And so this is kind of substituting two main sources, while at the same time electrifying transport, for example. That's certainly a major issue. So far I have talked a lot about technology. But transitions are not just about technology. There are organizational issues. For example, in this one chart, you see how the stock market prices of some of these electric utilities have developed over time. Meanwhile, they're going up again, but these firms have transformed as well. Some of them have sold all their fossil and nuclear assets kind of to have outsourced them to transferred them to other companies. So this is a bit like in the financial crisis, you had the bad banks, and here we have the incumbents putting away the old technologies, so that investors are still interested in investing in kind of these companies and the future of energy supply. And of course, we also have many changes on the institutional and policy side. This was the fun part. Now comes the theory side of the presentation. Transitions, more generally, social-technical transitions, what are they about? This is one of the examples, historic transition in transport. We know how the car has developed from a carriage to like modern cars. These transitions, again, it's not just about the core product, it's also about infrastructure, and it's about a lot of other dimensions which are depicted in this graph. So we see the product at the core, but then we also, I mean, there are cultural issues, societal values, there is finance, there is regulation and law, there is infrastructure, there's the supplier industry, there is maintenance, and it's us, the users of the technology. And in a transition, in a social technical transitions, many, if not all of these dimensions are changing at the same time. Not all of them to the same extent, but many dimensions are involved. This is why we talk about a social technical system. So the kind of systems approach, systems thinking, systems perspective is a key element when we talk about these kinds of transitions. A definition, so a social technical transition that is a fundamental. So there is something about the degree of change. It's said like it's supposed to be disruptive, competence destroying, however you call it. It's a fundamental, multidimensional, I talked before, long term, we're talking about 30 to 50 years, change of social technical systems. And what do we mean by social technical systems? We usually think of big sectors that produce services that are essential for our lives. Agri-food, transport, energy, water, these kinds of things. So it's kind of big. And no presentation on sustainability transition without this iconic figure. Who has seen it before? Another question to the audience. 1, 2, 3. Who has 5, 6? Who has not seen it before? Oh, many. Of those who have seen it before, can you explain what it... Okay. It's simple and it's complicated, but first and foremost, it's simple because it's basically about the balance between and the struggle over balance between the old and the new. So the old, this is the regime. This is also a notion we know from technology and innovation studies. This is a notion we also know from political sciences. The regime, this is the structure. These are the structures in place, right? And then we have the niches where the new is forming. These can be protective spaces where something is happening, and it's a battle between the regime, the existing, and the new things. And the third level, this is why it's called multi-level, the third level is a series of exogenous factors, things that are influencing whether these transitions take place and when they take place. And just to illustrate, like at the regime level, when we go back to electricity, we see like what I said before, like coal or nuclear, like the old ways or the established ways of power production at the regime level. Then at the niche level, we have the alternative technologies. And at the landscape level, we have the discourse on sustainability. We have major technology accidents, these things happening, disrupting the existing regime. And the basic narrative of the multi-level perspective is usually these regimes are very stable unless, like, from the landscape comes disruption, and at the same time niches have developed sufficiently that they are able to, replace parts of the regime. And only if that happens, then you get into this transformative phase, this messy phase where things are breaking up and where it's not clear where the things are heading to, and eventually kind of the new practices and technologies and regulations settle in, and a new kind of stable regime forms. That's the basic idea behind it. That's the same as I said before, just in a written form. I skip over this. Sustainability transitions is now when sustainability enters, so what we had before, what we were looking at before is like socio-technical transitions that were, among others, driven by, for example, new technologies, technology breakthroughs, some kinds of dynamics. But when we're talking about sustainability transitions, we refer to transitions that are driven by sustainability concerns. I've formulated in a way, these are socio-technical transitions that are associated with sustainability targets. I do not say they're driven by sustainability policy, because then we're in the entire discussion of how strong is the role of policy to drive these transitions, but I said like they're guided by public policy. So when you say sustainability and transition, it's about technology, but it's also about, and of course, about long-term sustainability targets. So you have normative aspects on board, and it's also about policy, some kind of policy involvement. There is hardly any transition without policy involvement, but in sustainability transitions, it's particularly strong. And then again, also when you talk about sustainability transitions, and this is what makes transitions research and transitions thinking, for example, it's what makes it different from, let's say, research on socio-ecological systems. Here in transitions thinking, people depart from the view, oh, these existing systems have to change. So the existing systems are not optimal, are not sustainable, so we need the systems to change. While in other perspectives, there is also sustainability scholars concerned with keeping systems in place. So here, sustainability scholars are all about those who like to see systems changing. But it's socio-technical, not socio-ecological systems. Okay. I also do not go into the details of this one, but when talking about these kinds of transitions, you get, again, a set of characteristics. This list is not exhaustive, but it helps you to, get a glimpse of the complexities when you're looking into this kind of phenomena. Again, they're contested, key role for policies, politics, and struggles over, vested interests, firms with and social movements with different visions of the future clashing, a lot of uncertainty, context dependent. What we might want to see in Quebec is different from what people want to see in Alberta or in Ontario or in other parts of the world. So depending on where you go, you might see very different transition pathways. And again, it's systemic. This list is then, when you look at the beginning or at the complexities and challenges of grand sustainability challenges, then you see that there is a kind of reflection that some of these issues show up again here on this list. Okay, that was the main introduction into sustainability transitions. This kind of perspective also has implications for policy. This is something I have not, so this is just something we have worked on over the summer. I have not shown it before, but I was thinking it's worth sharing it because it challenges the dominant view that is usually pushed forward by people trained in economics of how to address climate change. What is the key response from economics to address climate change? Price. There is a market, so carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is the solution and the silver bullet to climate change, right? And of course, we have seen, among others, protests against, raising prices. And this, again, it's a table we don't have to go into. It's just for the record. The thing is that I have to use this one. So there are different dimensions of how you approach things. And one is about the problem framing. One is about the policy priority. One is about how you deal with innovation. One is about context, and another one is about the understanding of politics. And what we argue is that when you approach things from an economics perspective, you have a certain view on things. So you frame the problem as a market failure. Your overriding policy perspective is efficiency. Start with the cheapest solutions first. You're saying, okay, we have to correct prices, and innovation comes along the way. You know, as we correct prices, innovation will be pulled off the bottom. You think, taking this perspective, you think, oh, carbon pricing is a universal solution. You can apply it to every sector, to every country. Let's roll it out globally, to every place and to every sector and to every industry. This is the silver bullet kind of type. When you approach it from a transitions perspective, your take on these things is different. You're not saying the failure lies in the market. You're saying it's more than the market. It's the entire systems that all go together. It's us, our lifestyles, it's the technologies, it's the policies, it's the business models. They all go together, and they all have to change together. And it's not just the market that is kind of flawed, but it's the entire existing systems that are flawed. Also, in transition studies, we tend to value effectiveness of policies higher than efficiency. So as time is running out for climate change, you can argue, well, let's pick the lowest hanging fruit first, but you could also argue, well, eventually it's about picking all the apples off the tree, you know, and maybe better start with the big chunks. So there are arguments in favor of saying, let's phase out coal, for example. Let's phase out coal first, because that's kind of relatively easy, though expensive, but gets you large chunks of CO2 emissions off the budget before you go, for example, for electrifying transport, which takes much longer time. And so on. Transition strategies highlight innovation and radical innovation. So there is a lot of focus on innovation. I will come to that in a second. And there is also a lot of attention to contexts being different, and that different contexts matter. So you go to the electricity sector, you go to transport, you go to chemicals, you go to different sectors. They all need kind of different policies and different approaches to be dealt with. You go to different places. You go to places where, you know, institutional frameworks are completely different. How would you expect them to put up a certificate trading system for carbon emissions? I cannot see that, right? So it's more about tackling these things in the specific context they are developing, and creating solutions in the context. I've tried to visualize just one element of it. So sustainability transitions policy is about innovation. So there's a strong focus on innovation, at different times. So early stage innovation is more focused on experimentation and this niche development and niche creation, but also diffusion policies. It's not just about getting things first into the market, it's also about fostering diffusion, supporting these markets. This is something like, from an economics perspective, you would like rather refrain from, because you're saying, okay, now it's in the market, let the market resolve things. But then you see, for example, in the case of photovoltaics, we see that much of the cost gains, and we have seen massive cost gains over a year, were only as the technology diffused widely. So it was less so about the invention in the early stage phase. It was also about later phases. And at the same time, put pressure on the system. This is where carbon pricing comes in. So we're not saying don't deal with carbon pricing. We're saying, but don't take carbon pricing as the first priority. Carbon pricing is one of many policies, and it can make sense in certain sectors and in certain jurisdictions to apply carbon pricing because it puts pressure on the existing. But then you might want to also accelerate this phase out with certain kind of policies, which we have seen in light bulbs, which we have seen in nuclear, which we are seeing in some places with conventional cars, which we are seeing with coal, like the phase out policy on coal in Ontario that was clearly a dedicated policy. Now you have to switch off these plants at a certain schedule. Okay. Yeah, I don't go through these. There are certain policy principles. Maybe just one. I mentioned many of these. Maybe just one issue that relates back to the politics. So whenever you talk about transitions and major fundamental changes in existing sectors, there will always be huge resistance. People don't like it, especially those who benefit from the existing or who don't like change, or we don't like major changes in our lifestyles. We want to still commute to work and use the car for that. And then suddenly somebody tells me that the gas is being more expensive. So how do I deal with this? I don't like this. I need to pay more. So what do I get from it? So obviously at the consumer level, but also at the industry level, you see a lot of resistance, which is why what policy science scholars call coalition building is essential, that you seek allies among those or with those industries who will benefit, like the clean tech industries. You try to get coalitions of actors who see that they benefit from first changes. You start with small policy changes, and as these new industries grow, as you get alternatives, as you, for example, get public transit improved, as you get electric vehicles improved, then you start to put more pressure on the existing, and then the coalitions of those benefiting are increasing. So it's a sequence of coalition building and policy change over time that, I mean, in an ideal world, get these transitions off the ground. To conclude, these transitions from a user perspective, from a business perspective, from a policy perspective, they are journeys through uncharted waters. Sometimes it's clear, this is where we are. Sometimes it's clear where we want to go. Most of the times it's not, and there are many obstacles, battles, anyways, many obstacles on the way, and it's also a question of you might change course over this transition. So it's not like a clearly laid out journey with all the steps are controlled along the way, but more of an also policy and businesses and everybody, they need to learn and adjust, and maybe the first idea was not working and then you go with the next one. This is, anyway, an illustration of how these journeys could look like. And just to conclude, if you want to know more about it, ask questions right now, but then also if you're interested in transition studies on a more permanent basis, there is an entire network of people who work in the transitions field. We have a yearly conference, we have a journal, we have PhD schools. Different kinds of, we try to maintain and provide different kinds of resources to support research in this field. It's a new field, it's a challenging field, it does not fit into the established disciplines, it's an endeavor in itself, doing research in sustainability transitions. Some find that, this is really exactly what I was looking for. Others think, oh, they are really doing, this is not the concepts I know from my textbooks. How can I apply them? How can I publish these things in established journals? I mean, these are all the issues that come up with when you do research in a novel field. Okay, this is what I wanted to share. Thanks again. And yeah, happy to have some questions.
So we've got 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So because we are recording this, could you please use the microphone, because then that will feed into the AV system. Okay, so I'll let you go.
I can't see it. There you go. I wanted you to talk a little bit about uncertainty. So let me finish my question, framing my question. So the image you gave me is sort of there's an existing technology that's really entrenched and a new spunky up-and-coming technology who's trying to take over, and it's sort of known that that spunky up-and-comer is better and that if we just let it, but it seems like failure, trial and error has a huge part. So what happens if we commit to something and it wildly fails, essentially?
That's a good question to which I do not have a good answer. So failure is part of a transition. Like I mentioned the example of the hydrogen car. Where was it? Was it hydrogen? Oh, no. No, it was just at the beginning, right? Here, electric versus hydrogen. This is a classic example. I mean, the Japanese still believe in hydrogen, so they also have the first hydrogen cars in the market. So, but like 10 years ago, nobody was believing in the future of the electric car. The electric car was from the 90s. It failed in the 90s. So the 2000s were all about hydrogen cars. Now we are only talking about electric, you know? There are these things like hypes and disappointments. When you're in the middle of a hype, it's very difficult to see alternatives. You really think it can only be the electric future, and this is what we are believing now. But I'm not sure whether the future of mobility will be electric. It looks like, but as I said, we're in the middle of a hype, everybody is doing it, and maybe it is electric. Maybe the future of mobility is beyond the car, at least in some places like big cities. So yes, as a policymaker, as a business, at some point you have to take a decision whether you want to invest in the specific kind of technology, and nobody can really, you know, you can create some reality around it, and you know, you get more funding, and then the technology improves, and you make it eventually successful. But apart from that, so there is clearly the trade-off. You bet on one technology, then it's less costly, but you may fail, and the chances that you fail are high. So you go with a portfolio, but maybe as a small business you cannot work with a portfolio. You have to go with one and see whether it works out. As policy, you better work with portfolios, and you better do different things at a time, but of course also like pushing different things into the market at the same time, maybe even competing technologies, you know, like for example with mobility, we need to ramp up the infrastructure. What kind of do we build charging stations now all over the place? Then we lock into we just create another lock-in into a system that is heavily dependent on infrastructure. Same with hydrogen. You know, these, yeah. As I said, to cut a long answer short, I don't have a good answer. It's best to work with the portfolio approach, but you have to make decisions at some point, and it's not. Nobody has the answers to these. Just the uncertainty is inherent, that you cannot do much about it.
Hi, Audrey Morse from Chemistry. This was really interesting. As I thought about transitions, you presented a lot of different transitions, but they all always unidimensional. So you go from, for instance, low carbon versus high carbon to the reverse. That's one dimension. But as we know, when we measure impact, sustainability impact, there's many, many different criteria. So how do you reduce that complexity? And in particular, in the case of transition for electricity, you know, photovoltaics or solar, or wind, they're great. They have this low carbon impact, but they also have lots of negative impacts that we don't measure here, such as the reliance of non-renewable critical elements and how we're going to recover the stuff after use and not dump photovoltaics everywhere and make a huge mess. So how do we think about that? Or is it, I'm going to say something thought-provoking maybe, but is doing a transition necessarily requiring that we shut our eyes to a lot of problems so that we move forward? Or if we doubt too much, we're never going to do it anyway?
Yeah, that's a good point as well. So we tend to be blindfolded. So we tend to focus on one thing first, and I have colleagues who tell me, you know, climate change is the most pressing issue. If we don't resolve climate change, so we should prioritize climate change over all other sustainability issues, because if we don't solve the climate change issue, we're kind of in a mess. We don't get out of it again. Well, that's one take, and that is certainly a take you can have in a developed country with many other sustainability issues already solved. But if you are in a different context, you might well have very different priorities, and climate change might or might not be one of these. And yes, ideally we would tackle different sustainability challenges at a time with every technologies. And I have to admit, in our field, people are many, not all of them, but many studies are very much tech focused. And again, this is a kind of, I mean, we talk about radical change, but in a way, it's a narrow approach. Because we say, yeah, well, essentially we want to go on with our lives, but just, you know, make a fix at some point of the system. You know, we get the solar, but we still, you know, use the electricity. We get the electric vehicle, but we still use the cars. So ideally, it doesn't affect us much. But whatever we do, usually with every new technology, we create new problems. We have seen that with nuclear. We have, every other technology, it first solves certain problems, like plastic. It was it was a great thing to have. It made things cheaper and made things more flexible, all these kinds of things. But once you have it at the scale we are using things, then it creates problems sooner or later. So why would we, you know, I would expect electric vehicles, I expect the batteries, resource extraction for the batteries, resource extraction for the PV plants. They create negative impacts. And we, like, only focusing on climate change will potentially resolve this issue, but will give us other problems on the way. And yes, ideally, we focused on many of these dimensions at the same time. Of course, also we see that in doing our research, you know, it's very complex already, but this is not an excuse. Yes, the trade-offs are there. Yes, we should focus on more than one sustainability issue.
Thank you. Oh, this is loud. So my question is, so it seems to me that a lot of this sustainability transitions work is focusing mostly on technologies and the sort of related pieces to that. And I'm interested how you deal with some of the more fundamental changes of human behavior, human values, and then, you know, in the words of Naomi Klein, if we see climate change as the problem that changes everything, and, you know, kind of this realization that this problem is not going to go away within a capitalist system based on this false idea of endless economic growth. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, we're just sort of fiddling at the edges in some way. So I'm curious, and a sort of related question to this is the work that I've been doing on transitions, or it's more in this transformations community. I think that is kind of delving into some of these sort of deeper value cultural transformations that need to happen. So I'm curious about how the transitions literature kind of deals with that big elephant in the room, and also kind of your thoughts about the transitions versus transformations communities, scholarly communities. Thank you.
So as I said before, there is a certain bias, and especially in my research, as I have more of a technical background, there is a bias of many transition researchers to focus a lot on technologies. That in some ways is helpful for other disciplines, for example, as political sciences or management studies, who tend not to spend too much attention to the material or infrastructural or, kind of, the kind of big capital intense things out there. So there is, for some disciplines, there is a benefit on focusing on technology, but for transition studies and the question of what kind of change do we need, or the focus on technology comes at the risk that we are overlooking the changes in lifestyles. In the transitions community, there are many who are looking at grassroots initiatives or like the transition town movement, so at non-tech social innovation, sharing economy, platform economy, or the digital kind of transformation thing. There are scholars looking at that. I myself, I'm not so strong in these issues, but there are people looking at that. And coming to the question whether do we have to get away with capitalism first before we can really talk about sustainability, honestly, I don't know. So I have colleagues saying, we don't have the time to get rid of capitalism. We have to do, because we are running out of time, we have to work within the boundaries of capitalism. Others are saying, no, the entire drive for more profits and competition, this is at the root of the problem. I don't have a good answer to that, unfortunately. But there may be people in the room who have.
So,
thanks again.